In March 2026, a drone exploded over Dubai airport. It was not a movie. It was not a drill. It was real. And in less than 6 hours, the largest connection hub in the world was paralyzed. Flights were suspended. Boarding lounges emptied. Property prices in the city center dropped more than 20% in 48 hours. Billions of dollars in foreign capital began to leave the country in silence, without announcement, without headlines. They just left. And then came the question no one wanted to ask out loud. What happens to a city that was built to be the center of the world, but that, in reality, never produced anything? Dubai is one of the most photographed places on the planet. Towers that seem to defy physics. Artificial beaches. Shopping centers with indoor ski slopes. A city raised in the desert in less than 50 years, using petrodollars and imported labor. But there is a detail that rarely appears in photos. Dubai manufactures almost nothing. It does not produce food at scale. It has no base industry. What it does is attract capital, tourists, events, fortunes. And when something threatens that attraction, everything built on top of it begins to shake. The attack on the airport was the trigger. But the problem came before. It came from decades of an economy built on perception, not on production. And here is what few realize. This has happened before. Not once. Many times. In places that also seemed invincible. In cities that were also called centers of the world. In economies that also attracted capital from everywhere. All of them collapsed. Some slowly, like a tide that recedes. Others in a brutal way, overnight. The pattern is always the same. And understanding this pattern can change the way you see where you keep your money, where you choose to live, and what kind of economy you trust. In the next few minutes, we will go through this pattern throughout history. We will see what happened to Venice when trade routes changed, what happened to Carthage when it lost the protection it thought it had, and what happened to Beirut when trust, the only real asset it had, disappeared in a matter of months. And we will understand why Dubai, today, is on the same path. But before getting there, it is necessary to understand a distinction that will run through this entire analysis. The difference between real wealth and illusory wealth, between what an economy produces and what it merely appears to be worth. This distinction is older than any of these cities, and it continues to be ignored by governments, by investors, and by ordinary people who deposit their savings in places that seem solid, but are, in essence, a mirage. If you are enjoying this analysis, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and write in the comments what you think, and from which city or country you're watching this right now. Venice, at its peak in the 15th century, was the richest place in the known world. It controlled the trade routes between the East and Europe. Spices, silk, gold. Everything passed through it. But Venice did not produce any of these things. It merely controlled the path through which they passed. And while that path existed, wealth flowed in an uninterrupted and seemingly endless way. In 1453, Constantinople fell. The routes changed. New maritime paths were opened by Portugal and Spain, completely bypassing the Mediterranean. Overnight, Venice ceased to be the center of global flow and became just a beautiful city with no real strategic purpose. What happened next is instructive. The richest in the city did not wait for the collapse to reach them. They observed the signs before the official narrative changed and began to move their capital into agricultural lands in the Italian countryside. Assets that produced food. Assets that had value independent of any trade route or political agreement between nations. Those who waited for everything to return to normal lost almost everything, but slowly. Venice did not die suddenly. It withered over decades, like a fruit that rots from the inside before showing any visible signs on the outside. Carthage was different. It was also a commercial empire. It also based its wealth on intermediation. It controlled access to the Western Mediterranean, charged for the transit of ships, accumulated what we would today call pure financial capital. But it had an even more serious weakness than Venice. It depended on mercenaries for its defense. It did not have its own army rooted, loyal, motivated by genuine belonging to the city. When Rome decided to eliminate it, there was nothing sustaining Carthage except the perception of power. And perception, without real structure behind it, does not withstand a determined legion. The city was completely destroyed. The collapse took less than 3 years. Fast, total, with no margin for recovery or reconstruction. The lesson between Venice and Carthage is fundamental. The speed of collapse depends on the type of shock. Gradual structural change kills slowly. War or abrupt rupture kills quickly. But the final outcome is the same for those who lack real production as a foundation. Beirut reached the 20th century being called the Paris of the Middle East. It was the financial center of the entire Arab region. European banks chose Beirut to open their regional offices. Gulf fortunes were deposited there regularly. The city operated based on a single asset, the collective trust that it was stable, discreet, and completely predictable. In 1975, the Civil War began. It was not a single definitive event. It was a constant erosion. Month by month, the perception of security was destroyed, and along with it, capital left in silence, without public warning. First the wealthiest, with access to banks in Switzerland and London, then the middle class. Finally, the entire banking system collapsed. Savings from decades were frozen. People who had $200,000 saved woke up unable to withdraw even $200. What destroyed Beirut was not the war itself. It was the destruction of trust, the only real asset it had. When that asset disappeared completely, there was absolutely nothing left to sustain the rest of the structure. 3 cities, 3 collapses, 3 different speeds, but an identical pattern in all of them. First, none produced something essential. All of them intermediated, connected, attracted flows of capital and people. Second, all depended on external protection, routes controlled by others, mercenary armies, stability maintained by fragile agreements. Third, the capital that sustained them was based on perception. It flowed in because it seemed safe, and it flowed out at the same speed when that perception broke. This pattern is not an isolated historical accident. It is a structure, a trap that repeats itself, because there will always be places that appear prosperous without actually producing anything, and there will always be capital willing to believe in that appearance while it lasts. The question now is, what happens when this pattern meets a city with $500 billion in real estate assets, 90% of its population made up of foreigners, and an economy that depends entirely on a functioning airport to continue existing? Dubai did not fall by accident, and it is not falling due to geopolitical bad luck. It is falling because it was built on the same 3 pillars that sustained Venice, Carthage, and Beirut, and that, in all these cases, proved to be insufficient when the world around them changed direction. The first pillar is real estate. Dubai turned sand into gold. Literally. Artificial islands, glass towers, apartments sold off-plan to buyers who would never set foot in them. Dubai's real estate market has moved more than $100 billion over the past 5 years. But who bought these properties? Mostly foreigners. Russians fleeing sanctions. Indians diversifying wealth. Europeans seeking favorable tax residency. Volatile capital, without roots, without emotional attachment to the city. When the perception of safety breaks, this capital does not hesitate. There is no attachment. There is no reason to stay. And a property with no buyer is worth nothing, regardless of the price written in the signed contract. The second pillar is tourism and services. Dubai receives more than 17 million visitors per year. 5-star hotels, global events, luxury fares. Everything depends on people continuously arriving and leaving. But people arrive and leave by airplanes. And airplanes need an airport operating normally. A single attack shut this system down for days. Imagine weeks. Imagine months. Tourism is not a resilient industry. It is one of the first things to stop when there is instability. No one books vacations in conflict zones. No company holds conferences in cities under constant threat. The flow simply disappears, and along with it, billions of dollars in revenue that do not exist in any other form within the local economy. The third pillar is the most fragile of all: image. Dubai sold to the world the idea of being a neutral, safe place, above regional conflicts, a territory where business happened regardless of the surrounding politics. This neutrality was a real asset, perhaps the most valuable the city had. But neutrality has a maintenance cost that rarely appears in economic reports. It depends on none of the surrounding parties deciding that you are too convenient to be ignored. The Middle East is undergoing accelerated transformation. Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. The tensions that Dubai ignored for decades are reaching its symbolic border. And when the image of neutrality cracks, the third pillar collapses along with the other two simultaneously. Here is what makes Dubai different from Beirut, yet equally vulnerable. Beirut had a local population with deep roots. When the system collapsed, people stayed because it was their land. Dubai has 90% of its population made up of expatriates. When the environment changes, they simply catch a flight and leave. There is no territorial loyalty. There is no concrete reason to endure discomfort. This means that Dubai can empty out in a way that Beirut never did. A city without a native population is a city without a human anchor. And without a human anchor, the collapse is not gradual. It is a mass exodus. There is a comparison that clarifies all of this precisely. Singapore looks like Dubai from a distance. It is also a small city-state. It is also rich. It also attracts foreign capital and has one of the busiest airports on the planet. But Singapore manufactures semiconductors. It has one of the most advanced pharmaceutical industries in Asia. It possesses oil refineries that supply the entire region. It built its own military capacity disproportionate to its territorial size. Singapore produces things the world needs regardless of how it feels. Dubai produces experiences that the world desires only when it feels good. This difference is not small. It is the difference between necessity and desire, between what withstands a crisis and what disappears within it without leaving a trace. The attack on the airport in March 2026 did not destroy Dubai, but it exposed something that the numbers never clearly showed. When you remove the perception of safety from an economy built entirely on perception, what remains is not enough to sustain itself on its own. And now comes the question that truly matters. Not about Dubai, but about any place where you keep your money, where you invest, and where you choose to build your life. The question is simple and practical, and it begins with a simple distinction that most people never stop to make. Does the place where you keep your money produce something the world needs? Or does it merely attract capital because it appears safe? This distinction separates two types of economies that, on the surface, look identical. Both have skyscrapers. Both have banks. Both have busy airports. But inside, one has roots and the other has mirrors. History shows what happens to each when the storm arrives. Lübeck was, in the 14th century, one of the most powerful cities in Northern Europe. It controlled Baltic Sea trade. When the routes changed and new flows demanded adaptation, Lübeck resisted. It tried to preserve the old model. It closed itself off to the new. It disappeared from economic relevance in less than 2 centuries. Today, it is a city of museums. Hamburg, in the same period, did the opposite. It opened its routes. It adapted its structure. It invested in real production around the port, not just intermediation. Today, it is the second largest port in Europe and one of the most solid economies on the continent. The difference was not luck. It was a structural choice made before the crisis arrived. That choice is available to governments, companies, and ordinary people who still have time to move their capital before the narrative changes. The pattern that runs through this analysis points to three questions that anyone should ask before putting money into any asset, in any city, in any economy. First, does this place produce something essential? Not services that depend on trust. Not real estate that depends on flow. Not experiences that depend on stability. Something the world would need, even in the middle of a crisis: food, energy, foundational technology, pharmaceutical industry, critical infrastructure. Second, can this place defend itself? Not with allies that can change sides. Not with agreements that can be broken. With its own capacity, built internally, that does not disappear when the external environment changes. Third, does the capital that sustains this place have roots, or just an address? Capital with roots stays because it has a reason to stay. Capital with an address leaves as soon as it finds a better address. If the answers are no, an address, it is a mirage. And mirage is exactly the right word. Not because the place is fake. The buildings are real. The money circulating is real. But the value they represent depends on everyone continuing to believe at the same time. The moment a sufficient portion stops believing, the value does not decrease gradually. It collapses. This is different from a productive economy. A semiconductor factory does not lose value because someone stopped believing in it. A refinery does not stop operating because market sentiment changed. A farm does not stop growing because a drone exploded in another country. Production is real. Perception is fragile. And the difference can be measured in dollars lost when the crisis arrives. Dubai still exists. It still functions. It still has lit towers and luxury cars on the streets. But the attack of March 2026 did something no economic report could do. It showed, in real time, what happens when the three pillars of a perception-based economy are tested at the same time. Capital began to leave. Real estate lost value. The flow of tourists stopped. And the image of neutrality, the most valuable asset of all, was marked. Venice took decades to wither. Carthage, 3 years to disappear. Beirut, a generation. Dubai has a variable none of them had. Digital capital, which can leave an entire country in hours, not months. The moral lesson is not to avoid Dubai. It is to understand what Dubai represents, and to recognize this same pattern in any place where you deposit your financial trust. Real wealth does not need perception to exist. It exists because it produces. And in the end, after every mirage dissolves, it is always production that remains. If this content made you think differently about where you keep your money, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from, and what you thought of this analysis.